on this affirmation model, you must affirm lest you damage. That leads into something else about the psychological man, so to speak, I suppose you'd say, or person. Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, all of the freedoms, it's hard to put a hierarchy on them. They go together, I think, along with freedom of assembly and so forth. They're all under attack now, really, in the UK, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, certainly in New Zealand, particularly interesting, isn't it? The Five Eyes countries, as they're known. Under the pretext of preventing harm, these things are under attack. And there seems to have been, over the last decade particularly, amongst young people, a loss of the idea of, and recognition of the significance of freedom of speech. It's now, you should only be free to say things that do no harm, which is very different indeed. I often say to people, actually, many of the most painful moments in my life are when somebody's told me a raw truth that I've either not recognised or been in denial about, and I've had to work it through, and it's been very painful, and I've resented it. But now we're tending to make these sorts of, if you like, honest contributions when we give one another character references. Sometimes, the old saying, what I'm saying doesn't mean I don't love you. It may be because I do love you. You need to hear this. But no, you can't do that because you may be harming people in this new age. And you analyse this rise of the psychological man, the triumph of the therapeutic, the persuasive concept of psychological harm. These seem to me to be very dangerous to our freedoms and to our workability as a society. And yet many younger people would say I'm talking nonsense, that they're the very things we need to do if we're to help people avoid victimhood, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think you've given a very good summary there of how a lot of the younger generation think about these things. When you think about, the great apostle of freedom of religion in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, his famous statement, what does it matter to me if my neighbor believes in one God, 20 gods, or no gods at all? It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Jefferson's sense of selfhood was connected to his freedom from bodily harm and his freedom to own property. That was the underlying notion of the self. Now we live in a world where the self is understood in these psychological terms. Of course, harm has been itself dramatically psychologized. So speaking words that interfere with my inner sense of psychological happiness becomes the equivalent of violence, as we've heard over the last 2 years. We hear about words being the equivalent of violence, doing harm. And I think that is worrying on a number of fronts. One, as you rightly pointed out, there's a pedagogical dimension to this, that one grows up by colliding with ideas that you don't want to listen to, whether they're philosophical ideas in general or whether particular suggestions relative to your own personal attitudes. We grow as human beings by being transformed by ideas coming at us from the outside. Secondly, to return somewhat to an earlier answer I gave, who gets to define harm in this context? It tends to be those with the best lobby groups. It tends to be those with their hands on the levers of cultural power. So what you see is a kind of totalitarianism or authoritarianism on the horizon. And that leads me to the third thing that's most worrying about the situation in which we find ourselves, in that for guys of my generation and yours, John, I think the fear was always of authoritarian governments. It was, I grew up in the shadow of the Cold War in Europe. The great fear was an authoritarian, or worse still, a totalitarian government taking over and controlling speech. What we're seeing now is big business controlling speech. Amazon has the power to pull Ryan Anderson's very moderately worded criticisms of the transgender movement, his book When Harry Became Sally, Amazon has the power to pull that book and sending a signal that anybody else who writes a book like this, you're not going to be able to sell it on Amazon that sell 90% of the books in the United States. So you're not going to find a publisher. No publisher wants to publish a book where 90% of the potential market is already off limits before the book emerges from the printing press. So the third thing that's really worrying to me at this point is our speech is going to be restricted by people for whom there's no democratic accountability at all. And I'm not sure that political philosophers have yet wrestled with this at a depth that allows us to think about a solution. Big tech, to go back to the information technology revolution we began with, the printing press created this explosion of freedom of speech. Big tech is actually in danger of leading to its dramatic restriction at this point. And I think that's a very, very worrying development.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because this new authoritarianism that you talk about, part of its mantra is that you must not offend. So you can, by hurting people emotionally, you are harming them. Therefore, all sorts of things that we believed in the past, including a lot of Christian belief, the very foundations of our society, can be harmful. So you mustn't issue. But the flip side of the coin is not only the censorship that you talk about, there's something worse. It is apparently permissible for certain elites to hurl the most unbelievable abuse via social media, to the point where we now know that cancel culture and so forth, and all the manifestations of ugly hatred that it reflects, can literally reduce some young people to suicide. So you've got a complete double standard here. It's do as I say, not do as I do for a lot of these elites.
Absolutely. I think if you're I've noticed this in the United States. If somebody on the conservative side of things hurls an insult, they can be finished. If somebody on the left hurls an insult, then they're speaking genuinely from the heart. That tends to be how it's played. And I think the issue there is if you are affirming the values of the dominant elites, you can get away with anything. If you're opposing them at any level, you can expect to be crushed.
And in one sense, that's not new. That's been historically true. It's just that there are new mechanisms being used to advance new agendas that perhaps we haven't seen before. But the sort of philosophical capacity to want to destroy others is as alive as ever. Now, tell me to the future then. We've touched on this issue. You think that perhaps the transgenderism movement has, to use an expression that you didn't, but there's overreach there. It's got to the point where people just sort of say, look, this really is nuts. I'm not going to put up with it. I'm not going to be put in a situation where I can't sit down and have a calm conversation with my child and point to the reality that you may be feeling uncomfortable now, but we need to work this through, and I'm not just going to automatically affirm everything you say. So perhaps overreach there. But as a historian, do you think, how more broadly do you think, is what we've painted here is a picture between the elites and the common man? Now, you've seen in America the whole sort of Trump thing, and I've always seen Trump as more the reflection of the problem than the cause of the problem. You've got a lot of people saying, this is just nuts. And you've got a great division, and that's painful to watch. But where might it settle, and what can we as individuals do to try and help find a more peaceful and sensible and respectful place in the middle where we can demonstrate a better way?
Yeah, very good question. If I had the answers to that, I could write a bestseller and be a very rich man, I'm sure. I think that you're absolutely right in seeing Trump as reflecting a division that already, Trump only got elected because the country was already divided. So that's a very astute observation. I think in general, when we look at Western civilization, as a historian, you can look back across the centuries and there are societies and civilizations that commit suicide and there are those that pull back from the brink. The only way of telling which is to see whether they put the pistol back on the table or whether they pull the trigger. Yeah, right up until the very last minute, you don't know. So it's possible Western civilization might simply fall apart. I don't think that any civilization that has survived justifying itself merely on the basis of itself, which is where we are now, I think. It is pure pragmatism that rules the way we are organizing our societies at that point in time. And I think that's a very precarious place to be. And a lot of the instability we see around us derives from the fact that we can only appeal to the way things are. There's nothing greater or larger that we can appeal to in order to justify how we do things. So on the big scale of society, who knows where it's going to go? I think the signs are not good at the moment, but we could pull back from the brink. What can we do as individuals? Well, first of all, I think we can certainly model in the way we operate and act in relation to others ourselves, that which we would wish to see in others. So I think there's a sense in which we have an obligation ourselves, even in the face of great provocation, to behave with moderation, politeness, and be as civilized and civilizing as we can. And also, I think, focus on the local. There's a limit to what any of us can do at the national level. Most of us just have a vote. In fact, in the States, I'm a green carder. I don't even have a vote at the moment. So there's not much we can do at a national level. But we can make a difference in our local communities. We can be good members of our local communities. We can be involved in the lives of our neighbors, of those around us. I can be involved in the lives of my students at college. I can open my house for hospitality. And I like to think that, if there's an analogy, perhaps in the more recent past, Eastern Europe, where was thoughtfulness? Where was decency? Where was humanity maintained in Eastern Europe? Underground at the local level. Pockets of resistance. And that's what I think we need to be thinking about, certainly in the immediate future. We've lost the levers of cultural power nationally, but we can certainly be influences in our local communities.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.